Here we are. I think I'm here. I see green check marks. I am still getting used to running the live streams by myself without my my mentor, Michael Weimer. If someone could chat something just to let me know that we're here, that you're here, that I'm here, that'd be great. 26 seconds into it. Yes, good. Okay. I'm going to wait 1 second here. I am not 1,000% sure about this, but I think we're good. Someone say something. Come on now. All right. Welcome to the 4th edition of Unregistered Live, which is the new revamped version of the Unregistered podcast. Unregistered Live, which normally is on Thursday nights, we had to move it from last week for various technical reasons to a special edition tonight, Tuesday. There we are. We are good. And we're going to have 2 of these this week. So this week is going to be chock full of me. Tonight, we're doing Unregistered Live. Tomorrow, of course, Unreported as always on Wednesdays. And then Thursday, I'll come back again for another Unregistered Live. In this show, we are presenting the work, the ideas, the discussions, the debates that we are having at Unregistered Academy. Ongoing discussions among the students, the members, the teachers. And okay, thank you for that. About the work we're doing, which is generally speaking of a scholarly nature, but always with an eye toward current events. Now, today we have announced and posted on the site, unregisteredacademy.com, our new winter term with a slate of 5 courses over the next 3 months. So I strongly encourage you to check that out at unregisteredacademy.com. Go to the courses page, you'll see them. They include a course I will be discussing tonight, which begins next week, next Tuesday. So you have a full week to digest what we talk about tonight. And you can check out the course in the meantime and sign up for the Academy if you'd like to take it and others. We also have, following that, another live course. And all of these become streaming courses. If you're a member of the Academy, you don't have to watch them live. You can watch the videos entirely whenever you want, just immediately after the live course is completed. Tonight, we'll be discussing race and racism, the history of ideas. Well, one small aspect of it, but possibly the most important aspect of it, and maybe the most controversial. Following race and racism, we will have one of my favorite courses to teach. It's called Save Your Nation, which is the history of American foreign relations from 1776, from the War of Independence, all the way through the 19th century and the first overseas war by the United States, the Spanish-American War. And that is chock full of interpretations that you simply won't find almost anywhere else, and will, I think, prove to be controversial for even a lot of people who are fans of my work. But check that out. That's also on the site, and you can sign up now for that as well. We will be reteaching the Bible with new guest speakers and lecturers from a variety of fields. We will have Orthodox Christian pastors, liberal reform pastors and ministers, Orthodox Jewish analysts, and of course, a host of secular atheist analysts too, discussing, but really doing a textual analysis of the key books in the Bible. We will also have a course on Israel and Palestine, now that the Gaza war at least is paused, hopefully for a long time, but it's unlikely that it's over. But this seems like a good time to revisit it and go over the actual history of what led to the war in Gaza. And then the final course of the winter term will be, I think it's the most popular course I've ever taught. It's called Postmodernism, an Introduction. and many people probably watching now know me because of things I have said about postmodernism in public. I will go over what I believe to be the basic precepts of postmodernism, the key works, the key ideas of the most influential of the postmodernist thinkers, people like Foucault and Derrida, who undoubtedly you've heard of many times, but probably have never read much or anything of. So I'll be presenting that as well at the end of the winter term, I believe in March or early April. But look on the site, unregisteredacademy.com, for all the information and the link to sign up to become a member. You can sign up as a monthly member or an annual member. Quite a good deal, certainly at the monthly level. Certainly worth it, I think, just to check out what we're doing over here at the Academy. So tonight, I will begin at the beginning of the story or the history, and this might sound odd. I want everyone to think about how I put this. The history of race and racism. Let's just leave it at race. This is a look at the origin of race. And I'm sure many of you are thinking, what do you mean there's always been races of people? White people have always been white people and black people have always been black people. And well, that's just not true. Because the concepts of race, of separate races, biological races of human beings that are hierarchical, some races being better than others, and that becomes racism, was invented at a particular time by particular people in a particular place. And in the Western Hemisphere, that time and place was the United States, or it was becoming the United States. That person was Thomas Jefferson. And that time was 1785. Now that's impossible, you say, I'm sure. Thomas Jefferson was about yeoman democracy. And I'm not even referring to the fact that he was a major slave owner, which he was. That is, in my analysis, almost irrelevant. We're not going to talk about that. I mean, we can, but for this, it's not important at all. The fact that he was a slave owner. Winthrop Jordan, who was an esteemed American historian, wrote many books on the history of race in America, searched and searched and searched, as have many other historians, for evidence of systematic, ideological, scientific thinking about race before the American Revolution, and couldn't find any. There were certainly negative references to dark people, darkies. There were even a few slurs, a couple epithets. I believe the N-word was invented early in the 17th century, before the Revolution. But there was no, as I said, no system of thought devoted to race in this country that we have ever been able to find. But we know this, because we know who the thinkers were, the public intellectuals of the time, the political leaders, etc., the clergy, people who would be able to create and disseminate a system of ideas. They simply didn't talk about race in that way until 1785. And it was Thomas Jefferson who initiated this. So we're going to spend this session, this live stream, discussing that. And I would love for anyone in the comments to bring your challenges. I'm sure there will be many questions and skepticism about this, but I will put forward the argument that I will tell you is now pretty widely accepted among academic historians of the United States, of which I am one, and I was trained by them. I don't think they're right about everything. In fact, I think they're wrong about most things. But the more sophisticated, I would say, historians of the United States generally agree with this argument. So we simply don't find evidence of discussions among public intellectuals about the existence of various races in the world of human beings and how they line up in a hierarchy, and why some are better than others, and in which ways they're better than others, the particular physical characteristics that characterize particular races. There was no taxonomy of human races prior to the American Revolution. You can take my word for that, but I prefer that you do your own research. This is what we encourage at the Academy. Any skepticism of anything any teacher says should be greeted not with dismissal or walking away. It should be greeted with doing your own research and showing us that we're wrong. But I'm here to tell you, and you can look it up, Winthrop Jordan, who wrote multiple books on this topic, has said in his books, that he simply can't find any reference, any discussion, systemic discussions of race or racism prior to the American Revolution. Okay, so that means that the origin of race as a concept and racism in the United States, that story has to begin with a different document, not in 1785, but a document in 1776. The origin of racism begins with the Declaration of Independence, of course, written by this guy. There is no racism in the Declaration. There is no mention of race or even implicit reference of race to race in the Declaration. I'm not saying that, but you cannot understand why Jefferson invented racism when he did without understanding the Declaration of Independence and, of course, the social history of the United States at the time. So here it is, or the first paragraph, and then I think it's the third paragraph as well. Here's the paragraph that everyone knows. We hold these truths to be self-evident, but here is the clause that it is argued, and I will argue, compelled, one might say, forced the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, to invent race and racism. That all men are created equal. Oh, we all know that phrase, and it sounds so lovely and egalitarian and universal. All men, presumably, he's referring to all men around the world at all times in history. All men who have ever lived, who ever will live, are created equal. Further, he goes on to say that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men have these natural rights endowed by God. All men. There's no qualification here. It doesn't say all propertied men, all landed men, all aristocratic men. It doesn't say white men. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now it's granting them essentially democratic or republican rights as well here. All men have the right to form their own government. All men. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Of course, this has been rightly considered to be the origins also of democratic, or if you prefer, republican thinking. 1776, there was no democratic thinking, no democratic thought or republican thought in the world. This is prior to the French Revolution. This is a world in which monarchies reign. And now there is this clarion call that all men, again, presumably all men forever and everywhere, have all these rights. And on top of that, those rights were endowed by the Creator, by God himself. All men. That's certainly how we take it now, the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. This is not for American men. Not just American men have democratic rights. No, he doesn't specify that. He doesn't say all American men are created equal. All men. It's radical. It's universal. It's absolute. His claims about democracy and equality. So let's just hold on to that for a moment and think about it. You might now want to. I did say wasn't going to mention Thomas Jefferson's main profession, but I think it is time actually to mention, of course, and to remember not just Jefferson, but all of the Virginian founding fathers were slave owners to some extent, or at least were very heavily involved in the slave trade in various ways. And that's known as well. We know that. And this is not, I'm not interested in judging. I could care less. But think about this. Thomas Jefferson himself, he wrote this in Monticello in his study, which overlooked the fields in which dozens and dozens of his slaves worked and toiled every day. He could literally see his own slaves from the desk from where he wrote those words. Those men and women in his fields were not created equal. Or if they were, we have a real problem on our hands, don't we now, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and all the rest? If they are all endowed by their creator with all these unalienable rights, if those men working the fields on southern plantations are created equal to Thomas Jefferson and have the same rights that he does, well, the American Revolution really looks like a revolution, doesn't it? Then it is unquestionably a revolution because the slaves would have been freed and made full citizens of America, of the United States. Now, I want to bracket that. Now, think about if you were Thomas Jefferson, you're leading a Republican revolution that's going to grant democratic rights, at least to some men in your country. And no one denies that the founders were keenly interested in doing that, giving democratic rights to at least a portion of the population, and of course, eliminating the monarchy. So bracket that. What would you do if you're Thomas Jefferson, you're leading a Republican revolution, but you also are sitting on a plantation that owns and forces to work hundreds of people who have none of these rights, who cannot have any of these rights if they are to remain slaves? Now, Thomas Jefferson did call for the abolition of slavery later, and he made noises about it here and there throughout his career, but he never did emancipate his slaves. So bracket that and think about what you would do as Thomas Jefferson. You have a couple choices. You can no longer be an egalitarian. You can give up these ideas about all men being created equal and having all these rights. That's option one. Option two is freeing your slaves and giving them these rights and calling for all slave owners to do the same, to give all the slaves all these rights, to treat them as equal men. That's option two. But then there's a third option, which we're going to talk about. But I want you to think about what that might be. Because what Jefferson has done by writing the Declaration of Independence in this way in 1776 is to create an incredible conundrum for the founding fathers, who, as I said, most of whom own slaves. And yet they're talking about radical global egalitarianism as well. How do we resolve this seeming contradiction? So bracket that problem, an immense problem, is it not, that the founders had? How will they resolve this obvious contradiction? So hold on to that for a second. Then this is, I think, the third paragraph of the Declaration. This is going to a somewhat connected but separate issue. Okay. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, he's talking about the people, it is their right, and here's, to me, the next clause that is the most important, and also this is the one that is the most undervalued and understudied. It is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. So the Declaration of Independence doesn't just tell us that we have the right to overthrow our rulers. It tells us we have the duty to overthrow them when they are despotic. We must, we should. It is an injunction. It is a moral order to overthrow our governments when they become despotic. What does this have to do with race? Well, there were places around the world when Thomas Jefferson was writing this that had absolutely despotic governments. As I said, monarchies reigned throughout the world at this time with clear despotism and no rights and no equality. This is non-controversial. We know this. The world was full of places like that. And it was the duty, according to Jefferson here, for all the people living in those places to overthrow those governments. And yet, very, very, very few of them did. In America, they did. In France, they did. And in a few other places, there were smaller, what are called democratic revolutions during this period, the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It's been called, in fact, the Age of Revolutions, but that only affected a handful of countries in this world. Most remained monarchical for decades after this was written. And the people living in those countries didn't do a thing for the most part. They were abrogating not their rights, their own duty to be revolutionaries. Their duty to create democratic forms of government around the world. And if despotism is such an evil, as he says it here in the Declaration, in fact, that's one of the themes of the Declaration is the evil of despotism, then someone else has to do it for them. If there are people living under dictatorships, monarchies, undemocratic regimes, doesn't matter where they are, it's evil. And if it's evil, it's the duty. And if the people there don't do anything about it, it must be someone's duty to do it for them. And this, I argue, in Save Your Nation and elsewhere, is the way the Declaration of Independence was actually read by the creators of American foreign policy from this moment onward. Every, and I mean this, every leader of American foreign policy, beginning with Thomas Jefferson, read the Declaration of Independence this way. It was the duty now of America to overthrow those despotic regimes wherever they may be. And this led, of course, Americans to set off on a whole series of adventures around the world attempting to do just that. Overthrowing despotic regimes wherever they may be. I'm just a little worried that my sound went out. I think my sound is not out, but let me check it. Good. Okay. Boy, we have some conundrums here at the dawn of America, don't we? At the beginning of the United States of America, we have two major conundrums to deal with. One concerning the slaves living in an officially egalitarian society. How do we have slavery existing in a country that's committed to egalitarianism? That's number one. Number two is, does this paragraph here mean that we must go invade every country in which there is a despot that is not being overthrown locally? And as I said, that was resolved. That contradiction was resolved by American foreign policy leaders saying, yes, yes, indeed, that's what it means. Stands to reason, doesn't it? Now, what does that have to do with race? Well, Thomas Jefferson was the first Secretary of State. Before that, he invented, essentially, the Marine Corps. And when he was a president, the very first thing Thomas Jefferson did as president, and this is covered in Save Your Nation extensively, was to send the Marine Corps all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and across the Mediterranean Sea, all the way to Tripoli, which is now Libya, to overthrow the king of Tripoli and replace him with another king who was friendly to the United States and more committed to such things as egalitarianism and democratic rights. And of course, the way that we, Americans, I should say, Thomas Jefferson and those who led this campaign, talked about the people living in Tripoli was utterly racialized. They were Mohammedans, meaning Muslims, but the discourse around this, and we discussed this extensively in Save Your Nation, treated Mohammedans as if they were a separate biological race of people, not just a different religious set. And this, of course, continued through the 19th century with the Civil War and Reconstruction. And that's in the course on race and racism. We go very heavily into that, as well as Save Your Nation. And very much so with the Spanish-American War and the war in the Philippines, the colonization of the Philippines. Racial discourse became central in the justifications for launching both the Civil War, the Reconstruction, and the Spanish-American War, not to mention the annexation of Hawaii. And so, but again, this will be the other courses for you to get the fuller story on that. So let's look at how Jefferson resolves this first immense contradiction in the official ideology of this new nation. So the Declaration, of course, is written in 1776, but in 1785, he writes this book called Notes on the State of Virginia. And much of the book has nothing to do with race, nothing to do with slaves. It has to do with various aspects. It's sort of a sociological and anthropological study of Virginia at the time, of various kinds, many different kinds of it. I don't want to say that the entire book is devoted to this. I think it's 2 chapters. I believe it's chapters 44 and 45, but not positive. But you can find it. It's very easy to find. But they're lengthy chapters he devotes to this very topic. He comes to slavery. And it's not just about slavery, because he then lets us know that this is really a story about this thing called race, which, again, as I said, you just don't find much discourse about it at all before this. So here's what he says about the people who then were enslaved in America. He says, whether the black of the Negro resides in the reticular membrane between the skin and scarf skin, or in the scarf skin itself, whether it proceeds from the color of the blood, the color of the bile, or from that of some other secretion, the difference is fixed in nature and is as real as if its seat and cause were better known to us. So there you go. These are biologically determined characteristics that separate the races. They are not cultural. They are not learned. They are inborn. You are born with certain characteristics depending upon which race you belong to. Then he says, and is this difference of no importance? Is it not the foundation of a greater or less share of beauty in the 2 races? Are not the fine mixtures of red and white the expressions of every passion by greater or less suffusions of color in the one? He's referring to white people now. So he sees in white people fine mixtures of red and white, more diversity, I suppose, of color in white people, which is interesting because we don't think of that now, but this is what was race science at the time. Is that not preferable, he says, to that eternal monotony which reigns in the countenances, that immovable veil of black which covers all the emotions of the other race? Add to these flowing hair, a more elegant symmetry of form. This is back to whites, of course. Whites have flowing hair and a more elegant symmetry of form. Their own judgment in favor of the whites declared by their preference of them as uniformly as is the preference of the orangutan for the black women over those of his own species. So we are receiving from Thomas Jefferson a taxonomy of the white and black races here. And this is the first such taxonomy ever published in America. Besides those of color, figure, and hair, there are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. They have less hair on the face and body. They secrete less by the kidneys. That was the actual spelling of kidneys in the 18th century, by the way. And more by the glands of the skin, which gives them a very strong and disagreeable odor. This greater degree of transpiration renders them more tolerant of heat and less so of cold than the whites. They seem to require less sleep. A black, after hard labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up till midnight or later, though knowing he must be out with the first dawn of the morning. So this Thomas Jefferson's slaves were known, as were many slaves in America, for having excellent parties late at night down by the slave quarters. And this is why it has been thought that Sally Heming birthed the child that belonged to Thomas Jefferson. That Thomas Jefferson liked to partake in those parties, liked to hang out with the slaves, and also liked to have sex with the slaves. To me, Notes on the State of Virginia is almost proof positive that that didn't happen, and that is his brother Randolph Jefferson who was actually responsible for fathering that child. Randolph was known, unlike Thomas, for not having judgmental attitudes about the slaves. He did not express racist thoughts like this, and was also known to, in fact, spend time at the parties, at the slave quarters, with the slaves on multiple occasions. A man who thinks this about blacks, I have a hard time believing would want to have sex with them. But so they party all night. That's one thing that blacks do. That's, of course, biologically determined, he's saying. There is their biological nature that they party late into the night. They are at least as brave and more adventuresome. So he's talking about physical bravery. But this may perhaps proceed from a want of forethought, which prevents their seeing a danger till it be present. So they're more brave simply because they're more stupid. When present, they do not go through it with more coolness or steadiness than the whites. Final passage. They are more ardent after their female, but love seems with them to be more an eager desire than a tender, delicate mixture of sentiment and sensation. So they are a far more sexual race, more sexualized race than whites. Their griefs are transient, those numberless afflictions which render it doubtful whether heaven has given life to us in mercy or in wrath are less felt and sooner forgotten with them. In general, their existence appears to participate more of sensation than reflection. Blacks are of the body, whites are of the mind. The classic, going back to antiquity, mind-body duality in Western thinking, that certain people are either one or the other. They are either ruled by their passions, their immediate desires, by their bodily desires, or they are ruled by their rational, disciplined mind. Here, of course, Jefferson is saying, whites are of the mind and blacks are very much of the body. To this, he says here, must be ascribed their disposition to sleep when abstracted from their diversions and unemployed in labor. An animal whose body is at rest and who does not reflect must be disposed to sleep, of course. Comparing them by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory they are equal to the whites, in reason much inferior. As I think one could scarcely be found capable of tracing and comprehending the investigations of Euclid, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. So, what did Thomas Jefferson do here? He resolved the contradiction that was presented by the Declaration of Independence. When he said all men are created equal, we now know, or he is now announcing in 1785, that he wasn't referring to blacks, that blacks aren't men. He's just removed blacks from the category of men. And so the Declaration of Independence is now perfectly logical and consistent. All men are created equal, but men are whites. And there you have it. This is the origin of what we have also called race science, which saw a diffusion of many, many different thinkers, but I mean, official public intellectuals, actual scientists who worked in universities through the 19th century, publishing reams and reams and reams of studies and books and manuals and pamphlets, giving lectures and speeches, teaching courses, every course in the Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, Columbia, all of them through the 19th century, gave whole courses in multiple departments on the races of mankind. And they laid out, or they elaborated on, Jefferson's basic framework here, that blacks are of the body, less intelligent, etc., and whites are more of the mind, more disciplined and orderly and rational, etc. It also, of course, became the basis in the South in the 19th century for the various justifications for the existence of slavery. And it made it, this was the chief obstacle of the abolitionists beginning in the 1830s, intellectually, to overcome. If blacks are indeed the way that Jefferson and race scientists describe them, if it is a biological fact that they are less intelligent and unable to govern themselves, we simply cannot give them the democratic rights to govern the country. And if that were true, I would agree with it. Wouldn't we all? If we knew, if it was a clearly identifiable group of people who were incapable of self-governance of any kind, giving them the vote and allowing them to run for office, as what happened after the Civil War, by the way, is a recipe for catastrophe. And it's better for them and for all of us, everyone, to keep them as slaves. This is the origin of racism in America, but it also led to race science in Europe as well. Many of the European racialists of the 19th century borrowed from Jefferson, saw him as an inspiration. And so it's quite an interesting irony, or maybe contradiction, in American history that the man who is thought of as the greatest tribune of freedom also invented racism, at least in the American context. And that has been troubling for many people who consider Jefferson to be a hero. And the people who consider Jefferson to be a hero include liberals, conservatives, libertarians, even some hard right-wing people, etc. And those people have a hard time with this. But maybe they shouldn't. Maybe there is something to know now about what the Declaration of Independence really meant, was really about, and why it led, ironically, to the creation of this system of thinking that has been arguably the most important, or certainly the most controversial, set of ideas in American history, and remains so to this very day, when we are all still calling everyone else a racist. So this is the beginning of the story. And I would love to hear what those watching have to say about it. I will take some questions in the chat, and I will try to do that by myself. So lay it on me. In the meantime, though, you should all go to Unregistered Academy and check out our new courses. And you should definitely sign up. Do we have any questions before I leave it there? Again, I'll be back on Thursday night, and we can do follow-ups then if you would like. I will be talking about a new topic then, but we can certainly have a follow-up on this on Thursday. I hope this helps illuminate certain things. And we want to talk about Ross Ulbricht in the chat. Oh, good. He's pardoned. I'm so glad. I really am. I did some work to help get Ross freed, and I'm really glad to see. And I met his mother a few years ago, and I'm very glad to see that. Very glad to see that. That's great. Okay, well, if that is all we have for today, I'm glad. Thank you all for coming. Another wonderful crowd. Great number of people once again showing up to this, and I'm grateful for that. Check out our work. Go to unregisteredacademy.com. I'll see many of you tomorrow night, and many of you on Thursday night, and many of you in our courses, in our classes going forward. Thank you all very much. Peace.